The morning sun streamed through the large windows of Murphy's diner, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. The small-town restaurant buzzed with its usual crowd of early risers, construction workers grabbing coffee before their shifts, and a handful of regulars who had been coming to the same booth for decades. At a corner table near the back, an elderly man sat alone, methodically cutting his pancakes into precise squares. Harold Mitchell was 83 years old, with silver hair that still showed traces of the military regulation cut he had worn for most of his life. His clothes were simple but clean: a pressed khaki shirt, dark trousers, and worn leather shoes that had been polished until they gleamed. On his left wrist, he wore a simple watch that had stopped working years ago, but he kept it anyway, for reasons he never explained to anyone. Harold came to Murphy's every Tuesday and Friday morning, ordering the same breakfast and sitting at the same table. The staff knew him as a quiet man who always said please and thank you, left a generous tip despite his modest pension, and never caused any trouble. What they didn't know was much about his past, except for the faded tattoo on his forearm that suggested military service, and the careful way he carried himself that spoke of years of discipline. The diner's bell chimed as the door opened, and 3 young men in their late 20s entered, their presence immediately commanding attention. They moved with the confident swagger of people who were used to being noticed, and their conversation was loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. The one leading the group was tall and muscular, with close-cropped hair and the kind of physical presence that suggested serious training. His name was Marcus Thompson, and he wore a Navy SEAL t-shirt that left no doubt about his military background. Marcus and his companions chose a table near the center of the dining area, their voices carrying as they discussed their recent training exercises and upcoming deployments. It was clear they were proud of their service, and rightfully so. Being a Navy SEAL required extraordinary dedication, skill, and sacrifice. But there was something in Marcus's tone, a certain arrogance, that suggested he believed his elite training made him superior to other forms of military service. As the waitress took their order, Marcus's eyes wandered around the restaurant, taking in the other customers with the assessing gaze of someone trained to evaluate potential threats and allies. His attention settled on Harold, noting the old man's military bearing and the way he sat with his back straight despite his advanced age. "Look at that old-timer over there," Marcus said to his companions, nodding toward Harold's table. "Probably thinks he's hot stuff, because he served in some war back in the day. These old guys always do," his friends chuckled, though one of them looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Marcus continued, his voice growing louder and more dismissive. "I bet he was some rear-echelon paper pusher who never saw real action. Maybe a cook or a mechanic. These days, everyone who wore a uniform thinks they're a war hero." Harold's hand paused for a moment as he reached for his coffee cup, but he didn't look up from his plate. The conversations at nearby tables had grown quieter as people began to notice the tension building in the room. The elderly man's calm demeanor didn't change, but something in the set of his shoulders suggested he was very aware of what was being said. Marcus stood up, apparently deciding that subtle mockery wasn't enough. He walked over to Harold's table with the confident stride of someone who was used to intimidating others. The restaurant fell silent as he approached, all eyes turning to watch what would happen next. "Excuse me, sir," Marcus said, his tone dripping with false politeness. "I couldn't help but notice you have the look of a military man. What was your rank in service?" Harold looked up slowly, meeting the younger man's eyes with a steady gaze that revealed nothing of what he was thinking. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet and measured. "I served," he said simply. Marcus grinned, interpreting the brief response as confirmation of his assumptions. "Served where? Doing what? Let me guess, you were maybe an E4 or E5? Right? Supply clerk? Motor pool? Don't worry. Every military needs its support staff." The insult was clear, and the tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Several of the other customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and the waitress behind the counter gripped her coffee pot tightly, unsure whether she should intervene. Harold set down his fork and napkin with deliberate care, then looked up at Marcus again. There was still no anger in his expression, no indication that the younger man's words had affected him. If anything, there was something almost sad in his eyes, as if he had seen this kind of behavior too many times before. "Son," Harold said quietly. "I think you might want to sit back down and enjoy your breakfast." But Marcus was just getting started. He had an audience now, and his pride demanded that he make his point clear. "I'm just curious about your service record, that's all. See, I'm a Navy SEAL, and I have a lot of respect for real warriors, but I also think credit should go where credit's due. There's a difference between elite special forces and regular military personnel." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and everyone in the restaurant waited to see how the old veteran would respond. Harold studied Marcus for a long moment. His weathered hands folded calmly on the table. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of experience and wisdom. "I can see that you're proud of your service," Harold said. "And you should be. Being a SEAL takes exceptional skill and courage. But I wonder if you understand what true strength really means." Marcus laughed, a sound that contained no humor. "I think I know a thing or two about strength, old man. I've been through training that would break most people. I've served in combat zones where every day was a fight for survival. What exactly did you do during your time in the service?" The question hung in the air, and Harold seemed to consider it carefully before answering. Around them, the other customers leaned forward slightly, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The old veteran's calm demeanor hadn't cracked, but there was something building behind his eyes, like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. 4. Harold took a sip of his coffee, the cup steady in his weathered hands despite the confrontation unfolding around him. The silence in the diner stretched on, heavy with anticipation. Marcus shifted his weight, clearly expecting either an angry outburst or a cowering retreat from the elderly man. Instead, he got neither. "You want to know about strength?" Harold asked, his voice remaining calm and measured. "Real strength isn't always about physical prowess or elite training. Sometimes, it's about knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, when to stand up and when to show mercy." Marcus scoffed, his patience wearing thin. "Spare me the philosophy lesson, Gramps. I asked you a simple question about your service record. What's so hard about answering that?" The other customers watched the exchange with growing discomfort. An elderly woman at a nearby table whispered to her companion about calling someone to intervene, while a construction worker slowly stood up. His jaw set in determination. The atmosphere had shifted from curious observation to protective concern for the old veteran. Harold noticed the movement around the room and raised a gentle hand. "It's all right, folks," he said softly. "No need for anyone to get involved. The young man is just curious about military service." Marcus interpreted this as weakness, as confirmation that Harold was exactly what he had assumed, a minor support person trying to avoid embarrassment about his insignificant role in military history. His confidence swelled, and he decided to press his advantage. "Look, I get it," Marcus said, his voice growing louder and more condescending. "You probably signed up during peacetime. Did your 4 years pushing papers or fixing trucks. And now you want people to think you're some kind of war hero. But there's a hierarchy in military service, and elite units like the SEALs are at the top for a reason." He gestured toward his own chest, tapping the SEAL insignia on his shirt. "This trident means something. It means I've proven myself against impossible odds. It means I've earned the right to be called a warrior." "What exactly have you earned?" Roaned. Harold's eyes moved slowly around the restaurant, taking in the faces of the people watching. He saw anger there, and sympathy, and growing outrage at Marcus's behavior. But he also saw something else, a hunger for someone to stand up to the bully, to show that arrogance and cruelty wouldn't go unanswered. "I earned the right to sit here peacefully and eat my breakfast," Harold said quietly. "Just like every person in this restaurant earned the right to enjoy their meal without listening to someone tear down others to build themselves up." The rebuke was gentle but pointed, and several people in the diner nodded in approval. Marcus's face reddened slightly, but instead of backing down, he doubled down on his aggression. "That's not an answer," Marcus snapped. "You're dodging the question, because you know your service doesn't measure up. You probably spent your whole enlistment stateside. Maybe got deployed to some safe rear area, where the biggest danger was a paper cut. Meanwhile, real warriors like me were putting our lives on the line." One of Marcus's companions finally spoke up, his voice carrying a note of warning. "Marcus, maybe we should—" "No," Marcus cut him off sharply. "I'm tired of people claiming respect they haven't earned. This old man is sitting here acting all dignified, but I guarantee his military records wouldn't impress anyone. Probably got out as an E4 after doing the absolute minimum." Harold finished his coffee and carefully set the cup back on its saucer. His movements were deliberate and unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. When he looked up at Marcus again, there was something different in his expression. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of steely resolve that hadn't been there before. "Son," Harold said, "you're making assumptions about things you don't understand. Military service comes in many forms, and courage isn't measured by the patches on your uniform or the stories you tell about yourself." Marcus laughed harshly. "Courage? You want to talk about courage? I've jumped out of airplanes in combat zones. I've swum miles in freezing water carrying full gear. I've breached buildings filled with enemy combatants. What have you done that even comes close to that?" The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Around the restaurant, people exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disgust at Marcus's behavior, others leaning forward in anticipation. The waitress had stopped pretending to work and was openly staring at the confrontation unfolding in her dining room. Harold studied Marcus for a long moment, as if trying to decide something important. Finally, he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. His movements were careful and deliberate as he opened it and removed something small. "You talk a lot about proving yourself," Harold said, holding the object in his closed fist. "About earning respect through actions, rather than words. That's actually something I agree with." He placed the object on the table between them, and Marcus leaned forward to see what it was. The restaurant fell completely silent, every conversation stopping as people strained to see what the old veteran had revealed. It was a small pin, tarnished with age but still clearly recognizable to anyone with military knowledge. Marcus's eyes widened as he took in the significance of what he was seeing. The color drained from his face, and for the first time since entering the restaurant, he seemed at a loss for words. "You recognize it, don't you?" Harold asked quietly. "Or maybe you don't. Maybe they don't teach much military history in SEAL training these days." Marcus stared at the pin, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to process what he was seeing. The arrogance that had defined his behavior just moments before was evaporating like morning mist, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. "That's impossible," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "You can't be. I mean, you're too old. And besides, those guys are legends. They're what?" Harold asked, his voice still gentle but now carrying an unmistakable note of authority. "They're too important to eat breakfast in a small-town diner? Too elite to be treated with basic respect by young soldiers who think they know everything about military service?" The transformation in Marcus was dramatic and complete. The swaggering confidence was gone, replaced by the kind of shock that comes from realizing you've made a catastrophic error in judgment. His hands were trembling slightly as he stared at the pin on the table, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. "Sir, I didn't know. I never meant to," Marcus began, but Harold held up a hand to stop him. "The question is," Harold said, "what are you going to do now that you do know?" The pin on the table caught the morning light, its metallic surface reflecting years of careful preservation. It was small and unassuming, the kind of thing someone might overlook if they didn't know its significance, but Marcus knew, and the knowledge was hitting him like a physical blow. "That's a Medal of Honor," whispered someone from a nearby table, and the words carried across the silent restaurant like ripples on still water. Conversations that had been frozen in anticipation now stopped entirely, replaced by an almost reverential quiet. Harold nodded slowly, his weathered fingers gently touching the edge of the medal. "Received it in 1968, he said simply. "Vietnam. Firebase Charlie." During the Tet Offensive, Marcus stumbled backward, nearly knocking over his chair. His face had gone completely white, and his hands were visibly shaking. The Medal of Honor wasn't just any decoration, it was the highest military honor in the United States, awarded for conspicuous gallantry at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Fewer than 3,000, 500, had ever been awarded in the entire history of the American military. "Sir, Marcus began. But his voice cracked and failed him. He tried again, struggling to form words that could somehow bridge the enormous gap between his earlier arrogance and this devastating revelation. "I had no idea. I never would have." Harold picked up the medal and carefully returned it to his wallet. "You had no idea because you didn't ask," he said quietly. "You saw an old man and made assumptions based on your own prejudices. You decided that your elite training gave you the right to judge and humiliate someone you knew nothing about." The elderly veteran stood slowly, his movements careful but dignified. Despite his age, there was something in his bearing that suddenly made his military background unmistakable. The way he held his shoulders, the precision of his movements, the quiet authority in his voice, all of it spoke to decades of leadership and service at the highest levels. "But you want to know the real irony?" Harold continued, his voice carrying clearly across the silent restaurant. "The reason I was at Firebase Charlie in the first place was because I volunteered to take the position of a younger soldier who had a pregnant wife back home. I was a master sergeant in the 82nd Airborne, and I could have easily avoided that particular assignment." Marcus's knees seemed to give way slightly, and he gripped the back of his chair for support. "The 82nd Airborne," he repeated numbly. "You were a paratrooper." "For 26 years, Harold confirmed. 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 in Korea, and more training jumps than I care to remember. I led men half my age into combat zones, where the mortality rate was measured in percentages, not individual casualties. I held dying soldiers in my arms and wrote letters to their mothers explaining why their sons weren't coming home." The restaurant remained frozen in silence. Even the staff had stopped moving, standing transfixed, as they listened to the old man's quiet recounting of his service. There was no boasting in his tone, no attempt to impress or intimidate. He was simply stating facts with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone who had long ago come to terms with his experiences. "At Firebase Charlie," Harold continued, "we were outnumbered 15-1. The base was overrun, our communication was down, and we had wounded men who couldn't be evacuated. I spent 14 hours moving through enemy fire, carrying wounded soldiers to safety, and calling in artillery strikes on our own position to prevent the base from being completely taken." Marcus was openly weeping now, tears streaming down his face as the full weight of his earlier behavior crashed down on him. "Sir, please," he managed to say. "I don't know how to apologize for what I said. I've never been so wrong about anything in my entire life." Harold looked at the young Navy SEAL for a long moment, and something in his expression softened. "Son," he said gently, "I don't need your apology. But maybe this is a lesson you needed to learn. I don't need your apology." He walked over to where Marcus stood, closing the distance between them until they were face to face. Despite the age difference, Harold's presence seemed to fill the space around them, commanding respect without demanding it. "You are a Navy SEAL," Harold said, his voice quiet but firm. "That means something. It means you've proven yourself capable of extraordinary things under impossible circumstances. It means you've earned the respect of your fellow soldiers and the gratitude of your country. But it doesn't mean you're better than anyone else who served." Marcus nodded frantically, unable to speak through his tears of shame and regret. "Every person who puts on a uniform and swears an oath is serving something bigger than themselves," Harold continued. "The cook who keeps soldiers fed, the mechanic who keeps vehicles running, the clerk who makes sure supplies get where they need to go, they're all part of the same mission. They all deserve respect for their service, regardless of their rank or their assignment." The old veteran reached out and placed a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder. "True strength isn't about proving you're superior to others. It's about using your abilities to lift people up, not tear them down. It's about understanding that courage comes in many forms, and that the most important battles aren't always fought with weapons." Marcus looked up at Harold, his eyes red with tears but clear with newfound understanding. "How can I make this right?" he asked. "What can I do to fix what I've done?" Harold smiled for the first time since the confrontation had begun, a warm expression that transformed his weathered features. Start by treating every veteran, every person with the respect they deserve. Remember that you don't know their story, their struggles, or their sacrifices. And maybe, when you meet young soldiers who look up to you, teach them what real leadership looks like. He turned to address the entire restaurant, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the room. This young man made a mistake, but he's willing to learn from it. That takes its own kind of courage. I hope we can all remember that wisdom comes from experience. But experience comes from making mistakes and choosing to do better. The silence that followed was different from the tension-filled quiet that had dominated the restaurant earlier. This was the silence of people processing a profound moment, of witnessing something that had changed everyone who saw it. Finally, Marcus straightened his shoulders and looked around the room. "Sir," he said to Harold, his voice steady now despite his emotional state, "would you allow me to buy your breakfast? And would you maybe have time to tell me more about your service? I think I have a lot to learn." Harold smiled again and returned to his table. "Son," he said as he sat down, "I've got nowhere to be today. And I think maybe it's time some of these old stories got told to someone who might actually listen." As Marcus pulled up a chair across from the elderly veteran, the normal sounds of the restaurant slowly returned. Conversations resumed, coffee was poured, and breakfast continued. But everyone in Murphy's diner that morning knew they had witnessed something special, a moment when arrogance met wisdom, when judgment encountered truth, and when a young warrior learned what it really meant to serve with honor. Harold Mitchell finished his pancakes while sharing stories of battles fought decades ago, and Marcus Thompson listened with the attention of a student discovering that his education was just beginning. And in that small-town restaurant, surrounded by ordinary people living ordinary lives, the true meaning of military service was quietly passed from one generation to the next.